Some sounds don't come from the world outside. They come from something waiting beneath it. The first time Caleb Mercer heard it, he thought it was just the house settling into the cold, the way old timber sometimes whispered when the temperature dropped below freezing, the kind of quiet noise you learn to ignore if you lived far enough from other people. But this was different, too measured, too steady, like something counting time in the dark, and before the sound reached his ears, Scout was already awake. The German shepherd lifted his head from the worn rug by the fireplace, ears rising slowly, not in alarm, but in focus, the kind of focus Caleb had learned not to question, because Scout had never reacted without reason, not once, not even back when they were both still in uniform, when instincts meant the difference between moving forward and not moving at all. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a frozen ridge in northern Montana, miles from the nearest town, wrapped in pine and silence, the kind of place a man chose when he was done trying to outrun what followed him. And Caleb had chosen it for exactly that reason, for the stillness, for the way the world seemed to pause out here, as if nothing could reach him anymore, not memories, not noise, not the echoes of things he couldn't fix. He sat in the wooden chair by the window, a chipped mug of black coffee cooling in his hand, watching the snow drift sideways under a pale moon. When Scout stood up without a sound and turned toward the far wall, the one built into the slope of the mountain itself. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stepped forward, one slow, deliberate movement at a time, until he reached the wall and stopped, head slightly tilted, listening to something Caleb couldn't yet hear. Then it came, a faint, dull thump beneath the floorboards, so soft it could have been mistaken for imagination, but it didn't fade, and it didn't shift like wind or wood or water. It repeated. Caleb set the mug down carefully, the ceramic touching the table with a quiet click that seemed louder than it should have been, and leaned forward, his breath slowing, his body remembering a rhythm it had once been trained to recognize, the space between sounds, the silence that mattered more than the noise itself. Scout glanced back at him, amber eyes steady, as if to say, now you hear it too. The second thump came exactly the same as the first, not louder, not weaker, just precise, like something keeping time beneath layers of earth and stone. Caleb stood, his boots pressing into the old wooden floor, each step measured, cautious, as he moved toward the wall where Scout waited, the air in the cabin feeling heavier now, thicker somehow, as if the silence itself had weight. He placed his hand flat against the wood, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing, but there it was, faint and unmistakable, a vibration that traveled through the grain and into his palm, steady enough to count. He closed his eyes without thinking, the way he used to when he needed to focus, and began to measure the seconds in his head, 1, 2, 3, until the next pulse came, right on time, like it had been waiting for him to notice. Scout shifted his weight, one paw lifting and pressing gently against the floor, the same gesture he had used years ago when something hidden needed to be found, not urgent, not frantic, just certain. Caleb exhaled slowly, the sound barely visible in the cold air, and for a moment, he told himself it was nothing, just the house, just the mountain, just the past finding new ways to echo. But the pattern was too clean, too exact, and somewhere deep in his memory, something stirred, something tied to a place he had sworn never followed him this far. The third pulse came, and this time, Caleb didn't flinch. He only listened, because some sounds, once you recognized them, never really left you. And this one felt less like an accident and more like a message, something patient, something deliberate, something that had been there long before he arrived, waiting in the dark beneath the cabin, counting the seconds until someone finally heard it. Caleb did not pull his hand away this time, even when the next vibration rolled through the wood and into his palm with that same quiet certainty, because something about it felt less like a warning and more like a signal that had been repeating long before he ever stepped foot inside the cabin. And the thought settled into him with a strange kind of weight, not fear exactly, but recognition, the kind that came from places he did not visit unless he had to. Scout lowered his head closer to the floor, his nose brushing the seam between two old planks, drawing in slow, deliberate breaths as if the scent itself carried information, and then he shifted slightly to the left, just a few inches, placing his paw down with careful precision, marking a spot so specific it could not have been random. Caleb watched him in silence, because over the years he had learned that when Scout moved like this, there was always a reason, something beneath the surface that the dog could sense before any tool or training could explain it. The cabin creaked softly around them, the wind brushing against the outer walls, but the rhythm beneath the floor remained unchanged, steady and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. Caleb crouched down slowly, his knees pressing into the cold boards, and ran his fingers along the grain where Scout had indicated, feeling for anything that did not belong, a seam too straight, a gap too clean, something human hidden beneath something natural. The wood was worn, older than the rest of the floor, its edges slightly darker, as if it had been handled before, long ago, then forgotten. Another pulse came, and this time Caleb counted it out loud under his breath without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, until the next vibration arrived exactly where it should, not a second early, not a second late, and the precision of it made something tighten in his chest, because he had heard that kind of timing before, not in a cabin, not in a place like this, but in a very different kind of silence, one filled with dust and concrete, and the waiting that came before something changed forever. He shook the memory away before it could fully form, focusing instead on the present, on the dog beside him, on the floor beneath his hands, because whatever this was, it was here, not there, and it was happening now. Scout let out a low, almost inaudible sound, not quite a growl, more like a breath held too long, and tapped the wood once with his paw, then again, softer, as if urging Caleb to see what he already understood. Caleb leaned closer, pressing his ear down against the floor despite the cold, and for a moment there was nothing but the faint echo of his own breathing, and then it came again, clearer this time, a deep, muted thud that carried through the structure beneath him, not loud enough to shake anything loose, but strong enough to be intentional. He pulled back slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the pattern of boards in front of him, tracing the lines until something clicked into place, a section just slightly misaligned, a rectangle that did not quite match the rest. He reached for the edge of one plank and pressed down, testing it, and it shifted just enough to confirm what he had begun to suspect, that this part of the floor was not fixed the way the others were, that it had been meant to open at some point, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The next vibration came, and this time it felt stronger, or maybe he was simply paying closer attention, and Caleb exhaled slowly, his hand resting flat over the spot, as if acknowledging whatever lay beneath it. Scout sat back on his haunches, watching him with that same steady gaze, no panic, no fear, only certainty, and in that quiet moment, Caleb understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before, that this was not just an old house making noise, not just wood and wind and time shifting in the cold, but something deliberate, something structured, something that had been built with purpose, and whatever it was, it had not stopped working. The thought should have unsettled him more than it did, but instead it brought a strange clarity, because if something was still running beneath this cabin after all these years, then it had a reason, and reasons could be followed. He placed both hands on the plank now, feeling the faint tremor pass through it one more time, and for the first time since the sound began, he did not question whether he should ignore it or walk away. Some things, once they started calling, did not stop, and some answers only revealed themselves to those willing to listen long enough to understand what they were being asked to find. Caleb did not rush the moment, even though every instinct he had once relied on urged him to act quickly, because this was not the kind of situation that rewarded haste, and whatever lay beneath the floor had already waited longer than he could measure, so another minute would not change its nature. He stood slowly and moved to the far corner of the cabin where his tools rested against the wall, a small collection of worn equipment he had carried with him from place to place, not out of habit, but because there were some skills a man did not leave behind even when he left everything else. Scout remained by the marked spot, unmoving except for the subtle rise and fall of his chest, his attention fixed on the floor as if the world beyond it no longer existed. Caleb returned with a pry bar and knelt again, positioning the curved end carefully along the edge of the misaligned plank, testing the resistance before applying pressure. The wood resisted at first, not because it was strong, but because it had not been disturbed in years, maybe decades, and the silence of the cabin seemed to deepen as the first faint creak echoed through the room. He paused, listening, waiting for the next pulse, and when it came, steady as before, he pressed down firmly. The plank lifted just enough to break whatever seal had held it in place, releasing a thin line of colder air that brushed against his hands like a quiet breath from below. Scout leaned forward immediately, nose hovering over the opening, but he did not move closer, as if he understood that whatever this was required patience, not intrusion. Caleb set the pry bar aside and used both hands now, fingers gripping the edge as he worked the board loose inch by inch, the old nails surrendering with soft, reluctant sounds until finally the plank came free. He placed it carefully to the side and revealed a dark, narrow gap beneath, no more than a few inches wide, but enough to confirm what he had already begun to believe, that the floor was not solid, that there was space beneath it, and that space had been deliberately concealed. The next vibration rose through the opening, clearer now, no longer muffled by wood, and Caleb felt it against his fingertips as he rested them on the exposed edge, a steady rhythm that seemed almost mechanical, yet carried a weight that felt strangely alive. He reached for the flashlight on the nearby table and switched it on, the beam cutting through the dimness as he angled it into the gap. At first, the light revealed nothing but darkness and dust, particles drifting slowly in the narrow shaft like time itself had settled there, undisturbed. Then, as he adjusted the angle, something caught the edge of the beam, a surface not natural to the earth beneath the cabin, smooth, faintly reflective, and positioned too precisely to be accidental. He shifted closer, lowering himself until his shoulder nearly touched the floor, and widened the opening slightly by removing a second plank, though it coming free more easily now that the pattern had been broken. The space below expanded into view, not a hollow formed by decay, but a constructed cavity, its edges straight, its depth far greater than he had expected. Scout let out a soft exhale, a sound that carried neither fear nor urgency, only recognition, and Caleb felt a quiet understanding settle into him, that this was not something recent, not something that had formed on its own, but something built with intention long before he arrived and left behind with purpose. The next pulse came again, and this time it echoed faintly within the space below, as if the source was deeper still, beyond what the flashlight could reach. Caleb held the beam steady, scanning the edges, and there it was again, that same subtle alignment, the suggestion of a boundary within the darkness, not just a hole beneath the floor, but an entry, something that could be opened further if he chose to continue. He sat back slightly, the light still trained on the gap, and glanced at Scout, who met his gaze without hesitation, his amber eyes steady, unwavering, as if the decision had already been made long before Caleb realized he was part of it. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow, but inside the cabin, everything had narrowed to this single point beneath the floor, this quiet, persistent signal that refused to fade, and Caleb understood now that whatever he had come here to escape had found him anyway, not in the form of memory, but in something far more tangible, something waiting just beneath his feet, patient and precise, as if it had always known he would eventually listen closely enough to hear it. Caleb remained still for a long moment, the flashlight beam steady in his hand, as if the act of seeing more might somehow change what he had already discovered. But the space beneath the floor did not shift or disappear. It simply waited, quiet and deliberate, holding its shape in the darkness like something that had been sealed away with intention rather than forgotten by time. The next pulse came again, stronger now that the barrier of wood had been removed, and this time it carried a faint echo that traveled upward through the narrow cavity, a hollow resonance that suggested depth far beyond what the light could reveal, and Caleb felt it not just in his fingertips, but deeper, somewhere behind his ribs, where memory and instinct sometimes met without warning. Scout lowered himself carefully onto the floor beside the opening, his body angled slightly toward it, not tense, not afraid, but grounded, as if he had found the center of something important and intended to hold it there. Caleb shifted his position and widened the gap further, removing another plank with slow, controlled movements until the opening stretched nearly 3 feet across, enough for him to lean over and see more clearly into the space below. The flashlight beam reached farther now, cutting through the dust and shadow to reveal walls that were not earth at all, but reinforced surfaces, smooth and angled, the kind of construction that spoke of planning, of design, of someone who had known exactly what they were building and why. He followed the beam downward until it stopped at a solid plane, a floor perhaps 10 or 12 feet below. And there, just at the edge of the light, he saw it clearly for the first time, a metal surface set into the structure beneath, rectangular, precise, and unmistakably a door. The realization settled over him slowly, not as a shock, but as a confirmation of something he had already begun to understand, that this was not an accident, not a natural hollow or a forgotten crawl space, but a hidden chamber, deliberately placed beneath the cabin, concealed by design, and still somehow active after all these years. The next vibration came again, and this time he could trace it with his eyes as well as his hands, a subtle shift along the metal surface below, as if whatever mechanism lay behind it was still functioning, still repeating its cycle with unwavering consistency. Caleb exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the stillness, and leaned back just enough to take in the full opening. The removed planks stacked neatly beside him, the cold air rising from below carrying a faint metallic scent that did not belong to wood or soil. Scout lifted his head slightly and looked toward Caleb, his gaze steady, patient, waiting not for instruction but for acknowledgement, and Caleb gave a small nod without thinking, the kind of silent agreement they had shared countless times before. He reached for the edge of the opening and tested its strength, then shifted his weight forward again, angling the flashlight deeper into the chamber as he searched for any sign of access, any ladder, any foothold that would allow him to descend. Along one side, partially hidden by shadow, he saw it, a narrow set of metal rungs embedded into the wall, descending in a straight line toward the door below, their surfaces dulled by time but intact, untouched by rust in a way that suggested they had not been entirely abandoned. Another pulse rose through the structure, echoing faintly in the enclosed space. And this time Caleb did not count it, because he already knew the timing, already felt the pattern settle into his awareness, like something familiar returning after a long absence. He sat back slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, and let his gaze linger on the ladder, on the door, on the quiet, persistent rhythm that continued beneath it all, and for a moment he considered what it meant to step further into something he did not yet understand, something that had been waiting long before he arrived, and would likely continue long after he was gone. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, brushing against the cabin with a soft, steady sound. But inside, the only thing that mattered now was the space beneath the floor, the hidden structure that pulsed with quiet intention, and the simple, undeniable truth that it had not revealed itself by accident. Scout rose slowly to his feet, stepping closer to the opening, his posture calm but certain, and Caleb knew without needing to say it out loud that whatever came next would not be found by standing still. Some doors were not meant to be discovered quickly, and some signals were not meant to be ignored. And as he looked down into the dim, waiting chamber below, Caleb understood that this was not the end of the mystery, but only the place where it truly began. Caleb did not move immediately toward the ladder, even though every part of the scene below seemed to draw him in with quiet persistence, because there was a difference between discovering something and stepping fully into it. And he had learned long ago that crossing that line required more than curiosity. It required acceptance of whatever might follow. He reached back and adjusted the lantern hanging from a nail on the wall, turning its dial until the flame inside grew steadier, then placed it closer to the opening so its warm light softened the sharp edge of the flashlight beam, casting a deeper, more grounded glow into the chamber below. The metal rungs caught that light faintly, their surfaces worn but intact, leading down in a straight, unwavering path as if they had been waiting not for years, but for a moment like this. Scout stepped closer to Caleb's side, his shoulder brushing lightly against Caleb's arm, a quiet gesture of presence rather than urgency, and Caleb rested his hand briefly against the dog's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath his fingers, the calm that never came from ignorance, but from understanding. The next pulse rose again, echoing through the open space with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore, and this time Caleb did not count it, did not analyze it. He simply listened, because the rhythm had already settled into him in a way that numbers could not explain. He leaned forward and lowered one foot onto the first rung, testing its strength before committing his weight, the metal holding firm without a sound. And for a moment he paused there, balanced between the familiar world above and the unknown below. The air that drifted upward carried a faint chill, cooler than the cabin, touched with that same metallic trace that lingered just beyond recognition, and it reminded him not of decay, but of something preserved, something maintained in quiet isolation. Scout watched him closely, ears forward, body still, as if measuring the decision alongside him. And when Caleb shifted his weight fully onto the ladder and began to descend, the dog did not hesitate, moving to the edge of the opening and settling there, keeping watch with the same steady focus he had shown from the beginning. Each rung brought Caleb lower into the chamber, the light above fading slightly as the walls closed in around him, their surfaces smooth and angled, reflecting the beam of his flashlight in muted glints that suggested deliberate design rather than simple construction. The rhythm continued, steady as ever, and with each step it seemed to grow clearer, not louder, but more defined, as if distance had never truly separated him from its source. When his boots finally touched the floor below, the sound was soft, almost absorbed by the space itself, and he stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting the stillness settle around him in a way that felt different from the silence above, deeper, more contained, as if this place held its own sense of time. The metal door stood just a few feet away, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a small panel set into one side, barely visible in the low light. And as Caleb stepped closer, he could feel the faint vibration traveling through the ground beneath him, rising up through the soles of his boots in that same steady pattern. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering just inches from the surface, not yet touching it, because something about the moment felt precise, as if the timing mattered, as if whatever lay beyond the door was not simply waiting to be found, but waiting to be understood. Above him, faint but steady, Scout's silhouette remained at the edge of the opening, watching, present, and Caleb realized then that he was not alone in this discovery, not truly, because the dog had known long before he had listened when he had not, and had led him here without hesitation. The next pulse came, and Caleb placed his hand gently against the metal, feeling the vibration pass through it, not cold, not lifeless, but steady, controlled, and in that quiet contact, something shifted inside him, not fear, not doubt, but a recognition that this was not just a hidden place beneath a cabin, but something that had been waiting for someone who would finally listen closely enough to arrive at exactly this moment. Caleb kept his hand against the metal a moment longer, feeling the steady pulse move through it like a quiet current, not forceful, not threatening, but deliberate, as if something on the other side understood the exact space between each second and chose to remain within it. He lowered his hand slowly and shifted his attention to the small panel set into the right side of the door, its surface slightly recessed, edges worn smooth as though it had once been used often, then left untouched for years. The flashlight beam revealed faint markings along its border, not letters, not symbols he immediately recognized, but patterns etched with intention, lines that curved and intersected in a way that suggested purpose rather than decoration. He brushed his fingers lightly across the panel, tracing the grooves, and for a brief moment the vibration beneath his boots seemed to align with the motion, not changing, not reacting, but sinking in a way that made the silence around him feel less empty and more attentive. Above, Scout shifted slightly, the soft scrape of his paw against the wood barely audible, but enough to remind Caleb that he was still there, still watching, still anchored to the moment in a way that grounded everything else. Caleb exhaled slowly, the air cool against his face, and leaned closer to the panel, studying it. Not as an object to force open, but as something meant to be understood. The next pulse came, and this time he counted it again without thinking, 1, 2, 3, his voice barely more than a whisper, until the vibration returned exactly on cue, steady and unbroken. He waited through another cycle, and another, letting the rhythm settle into his breathing, into the space between thoughts, until it no longer felt external, but internal, like something he had always known but never fully recognized. Then, without rushing, he placed his hand flat against the panel, aligning his palm with the center of the etched pattern, and held it there. For a moment, nothing changed. The vibration continued beneath him, The air remained still, and the door stood as it had before, silent and unmoving. But Caleb did not pull away, because he had learned that not every response came immediately, and not every system revealed itself through force. Another pulse came, and as it did, he felt a subtle shift beneath his hand, not a movement of the door itself, but a faint warmth spreading through the metal, as if something within had acknowledged the contact. The sensation was slight, almost easy to dismiss, but it was there, unmistakable, and Caleb's focus sharpened as he kept his hand steady, resisting the urge to react too quickly. The next cycle passed, then another, and with each repetition the warmth grew just enough to confirm that this was not imagination, not coincidence, but interaction, something responding in its own quiet, measured way. He adjusted his stance slightly, bringing his other hand closer, not to force anything, but to steady himself, and as the next pulse arrived, a soft click echoed from within the door, so faint it might have been lost if he had not been listening so closely. Caleb's eyes lifted to the center of the metal surface, where a thin seam, nearly invisible before, now caught the edge of the light, tracing a vertical line that had not been there moments ago. He did not move immediately. He simply watched, breathing slow and even, as the pattern continued beneath him, and with the next pulse, the seam widened just enough to confirm what had begun to unfold. Above, Scout let out a quiet breath, a sound of recognition rather than surprise, and Caleb felt a calm settle into him that he could not fully explain, because whatever lay beyond the door was no longer just hidden, it was responding, revealing itself not through force or chance, but through patience, through timing, through something that required him to listen as much as act. The door did not swing open. It did not reveal everything at once. It simply shifted, inch by inch, as if allowing the moment to unfold at the same pace as the rhythm that had guided him here. And Caleb understood then that this was not something meant to be rushed, but something meant to be entered with the same steady attention that had uncovered it. He kept his hand in place, feeling the warmth, the vibration, the quiet alignment between his movement and whatever lay beyond. And in that stillness, he realized that the sound he had first heard above was never just noise. It was an invitation, one that had been waiting not for someone to break it open, but for someone to hear it clearly enough to respond in kind. The seam widened slowly, not with the abrupt motion of something mechanical forcing itself open, but with the quiet precision of a system that had never forgotten its purpose, each movement aligning perfectly with the steady rhythm that continued beneath Caleb's feet. And as the narrow gap grew, a faint glow emerged from within, soft and muted, not bright enough to illuminate the entire chamber, but enough to reveal that the darkness beyond the door was not empty. Caleb did not step forward immediately, even as the opening reached the width of his hand, because something about the moment demanded stillness, demanded respect for the pace at which it unfolded, and he found himself breathing in time with the pulses now, each inhale and exhale matching the quiet pattern that had guided him here. The light within the chamber flickered gently, not erratic, but alive in a way that suggested continuity, as if it had been burning or functioning for years without interruption, sustained by something unseen, something steady. Above, Scout shifted again, his silhouette framed against the opening in the floor, his ears forward, body still, watching not with concern but with a calm awareness that mirrored Caleb's own, as if the dog understood that this was not a moment of danger, but of revelation. Caleb lowered his hand from the panel and allowed the door to continue its measured movement, the metal sliding just enough to create a narrow passage. And as the next pulse came, the opening reached its widest point, no more than a couple of feet across, but enough to step through. He angled the flashlight toward the interior, and the beam revealed a space unlike anything he had expected, not cluttered, not abandoned, but ordered, almost pristine, as if time had been held at a distance. The walls inside were lined with the same smooth material, but lighter in color, reflecting the soft glow that seemed to come from a series of narrow strips embedded along the ceiling, their light constant and warm, untouched by flicker or decay. In the center of the room stood a structure, not large, perhaps the size of a workbench, its surface clean and uncluttered except for a single object resting at its center, something rectangular, dark against the pale surface, positioned with deliberate care. Caleb stepped closer to the threshold, The faint hum of the system now more noticeable, not loud, but present, a quiet continuity that filled the space without overwhelming it. And as he crossed into the room, the air changed subtly, warmer, more still, carrying none of the dust or age he had expected, but instead a sense of preservation, as if this place had been sealed not to hide decay, but to protect something intact. Scout remained above, watching, but Caleb could feel the dog's attention following him, anchored to every movement, every shift in the air, and it grounded him in a way nothing else could. He moved slowly toward the center of the room, the light revealing more details with each step, panels set into the walls, faint lines tracing patterns that echoed those on the door, all of it designed with a precision that spoke of intention, not improvisation. The pulses continued, but here, inside the chamber, they felt different, not distant, not filtered through layers of wood and earth, but immediate, as if the source was no longer hidden, but present, integrated into the space itself. Caleb reached the structure at the center and stopped, his gaze settling on the object resting there, its surface smooth, edges defined, its presence unmistakable in its simplicity, and for a moment he did not touch it, did not reach for it, because something about the stillness of the room suggested that this, too, was part of the pattern, part of the timing that had brought him here. The light above remained steady, the air unmoving, and the rhythm beneath his feet continued without pause. And in that quiet alignment of sound and space, Caleb understood that whatever this place was, whatever it had been built to hold, it had not been abandoned. It had been waiting, not for anyone, but for someone who would arrive at exactly the right moment, guided not by chance, but by the simple act of listening closely enough to hear what others would have missed. Caleb stood in the center of the room, the quiet hum surrounding him like a presence rather than a sound, his eyes fixed on the object resting on the surface before him, because despite everything he had uncovered, everything he had followed to reach this point, it was this single, carefully placed item that seemed to hold the weight of the entire space. It was not large, perhaps the size of a small case, its surface dark and smooth, edges softened by time but not worn, as if it had been preserved rather than used, and the light from above traced its outline with a subtle clarity that made it impossible to ignore. The rhythm beneath his feet continued, steady and unwavering, and for the first time since he had entered the chamber, Caleb noticed that it no longer felt separate from the object in front of him, but connected to it, as if the pulses themselves were guiding him toward this exact moment. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering just above the surface, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the precision that had brought him here, and as the next pulse came, he placed his fingers gently against the object. The response was immediate, not dramatic, not forceful, but unmistakable, a faint warmth spreading beneath his touch, similar to what he had felt at the door, but more focused now, more intentional, as if this was the true center of whatever system had been hidden below the cabin. Above him, Scout let out a soft, steady breath, and Caleb could feel the dog's presence even without looking, a quiet reassurance that he was exactly where he needed to be. He slid his hand along the edge of the object and found a subtle indentation, a seam that mirrored the one on the door, and without forcing it, without rushing, he applied gentle pressure, allowing the mechanism to respond in its own time. Another pulse passed, and with it came a soft click, barely audible but clear enough to signal that something had shifted. The top of the case lifted slowly, not fully opening at once, but rising just enough to reveal the interior, and Caleb leaned closer, his breath steady, his focus absolute. Inside, there was no clutter, no complex machinery, only a single item placed carefully within, something that seemed almost out of place in its simplicity, a small, rectangular device, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a faint, pulsing light at its center. The light moved in the same rhythm he had been following since the beginning, steady, precise, unwavering, and as Caleb watched it, something deep within his memory stirred, not a full recollection, but a feeling, a recognition of pattern, of purpose, of something designed not just to function, but to communicate. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he studied it, letting the rhythm guide his understanding, letting the quiet of the room settle around him until the difference between sound and silence no longer felt distinct. The device continued its steady pulse, and with each cycle, Caleb felt a growing certainty that this was not just a piece of forgotten equipment, not just a remnant of something left behind, but a message, one that had been waiting, preserved in this hidden chamber, repeating itself over and over again until someone arrived who could hear it, who could follow it, who could stand here and understand that it was never random. He finally reached in and lifted the device carefully, its weight balanced, solid, and as he held it, the pulse did not stop, did not change, it simply continued, now closer, now clearer, and in that moment, Caleb understood something that went beyond explanation, beyond logic, because whatever this was, whatever it had been built for, it had not been waiting for just anyone. It had been waiting for someone who would listen long enough to find it, someone who would recognize its rhythm not as noise, but as meaning. And as he stood there holding it in the quiet chamber beneath the cabin, he realized that the truth he had been led to was not hidden in the walls or the floor or the structure itself, but in the simple, undeniable fact that some signals are never meant to fade. They are meant to endure until the right person is ready to hear them. Caleb remained still for a long moment, the device resting in his hands, its steady pulse now no longer something he had to search for, but something he could feel clearly, as if the rhythm had moved from the floor beneath him into his own awareness, aligning with his breath, his thoughts, the quiet space he had been trying to build for himself since coming to this remote place. The chamber around him remained unchanged, the soft light steady, the air still, holding everything in a kind of suspended calm that felt untouched by the passing of time. And for the first time since he had arrived at the cabin, Caleb did not feel like he was trying to escape anything. Above, Scout shifted slightly, and a faint sound of movement echoed down the ladder, followed by the soft, familiar rhythm of paws against metal as the dog began his descent without hesitation, each step measured and confident, as if he had already accepted whatever this place was long before Caleb understood it. When Scout reached the floor, he moved directly to Caleb's side, his presence quiet but grounding, his amber eyes lifting toward the device for just a moment before settling back on Caleb, calm and certain, as if confirming what needed no words. Caleb lowered his gaze again to the object in his hands, studying the faint pulse of light at its center, and as he did, something within the device shifted, not physically, not in a way that changed its shape, but in the way the light began to expand slightly with each cycle, growing just enough to illuminate a thin line across its surface, a line that had not been visible before. He adjusted his grip carefully, turning the device just enough for the light to reveal what lay beneath it, and there, etched faintly into the surface, were markings, not worn, not damaged, but preserved, waiting for the right angle, the right moment, the right light to be seen. They were not random. They formed a pattern, one that mirrored the lines he had seen on the panel and the walls, but more refined, more deliberate, as if this was the final expression of whatever system had been built here. He traced them lightly with his fingers, and as he did, the pulse shifted again, not in speed, not in timing, but in tone, the faint hum deepening just enough to be felt more clearly in the space around him. Scout stepped closer, his nose brushing gently against Caleb's arm, and for a brief moment, Caleb closed his eyes, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding, because the feeling that settled over him was not confusion or fear, it was clarity, the kind that did not come from answers, but from connection. He opened his eyes again and looked around the chamber, at the walls, the light, the door that had opened only when he had aligned himself with its rhythm, and he realized that this place had not been built to hide something from the world. It had been built to preserve something for it, to hold a message, a signal, a pattern that would continue repeating until someone came who could recognize it, not just hear it, but follow it, trust it, and arrive here not by accident, but by choice. The pulses continued, steady and unwavering, but now they no longer felt like something separate from him. They felt like part of the same quiet system, something that had always been there, waiting beneath the noise of everything else. Caleb took a slow breath and held the device a little closer, not gripping it tightly, but carrying it with a kind of care that came from understanding its purpose, even if he could not yet explain it. Scout remained beside him, steady as ever, his presence unchanged, as if to remind him that he had not come here alone, that the path had been shared from the very beginning. Caleb turned slightly toward the ladder, his gaze lifting toward the opening above where the faint outline of the cabin floor could still be seen. And for a moment he stood there, suspended between what he had found and what waited beyond it, knowing that whatever this was, whatever it meant, it did not end here. Some discoveries were not meant to be kept hidden beneath the ground, and some signals were not meant to stay unanswered. He placed one foot on the first rung and began to climb, the device still pulsing steadily in his hand, Scout following close behind. And as they moved upward, leaving the quiet chamber below, the rhythm did not fade. It remained constant and clear, a reminder that some truths do not need to be explained to be understood, and some miracles do not arrive as sudden moments of change, but as quiet patterns that guide those who are willing to listen towards something they were always meant to find.